I want to welcome those of you who are here from yesterday's celebration of Pastor Ray's life. We have been studying the book of Acts. And last week we took a little bit of a break. We had Pastor Ortiz from our Hispanic ministry here, and he preached last week. How many of you heard him and loved what Pastor Ortiz had to say? Absolutely. But we're going to continue in our study of Acts. And as we do that, the question that we're going to be asking, or the theme of Acts 22 in our study today, is the question, what shall I do, Lord? What shall I do, Lord? And I want to tell you that was a question for me. Most of you know my background. I wasn't a Christian. I didn't grow up in a Christian household. But when I was younger, one of the things that happened to me is that a junior high friend of mine showed me a magazine of some pictures that I shouldn't have seen. You know what I'm talking about, this pornography that was shown to me when I was younger. And I saw that, and it did something to me, and I remember wanting to look at that more and more, and I did. And I started to feel terrible about myself because of that, and I didn't know what to do about it. My parents lived up in a hill outside the county in the East Foothills of San Jose, and we had a big house, but we didn't have one thing. We didn't have regular garbage collection. So my mom said, well, this is what we're going to do, and she said, we're going to build a little shed in the back without a roof, just some walls, and we're going to, every day when we have garbage, we're going to put that in the garbage cans. We'll fill that with garbage cans, and once a month the garbage collector would come to collect that garbage. Well, so what happened was that my brother Jesse, who was a lot younger than me, that it was our job to, at the end of the month when the trash collectors came, is to put the garbage cans, all full of garbage, about 10 of them, out in the street, and they'd come and pick them up for us. Well, as living in the country, kind of in the hills, well, we had all sorts of animals that loved the garbage. So throughout the week and throughout the month, they would get into the garbage, right? And so then the night before a garbage collector would come, my mom would wake me up and say, Hecky, Hecky, and don't tell anybody, that's what she used to call me. But she'd say, Hecky, Hecky, get up, you need to go get the garbage, you put it outside. And, Mom, it's dark. Well, you got to go. I would say, well, you're going to wake me up. Jesse, come on, you got to help me. So my younger brother, Jesse, we got to go and clean up the garbage. Well, we'd go out there, and it was a mess. I mean, garbage everywhere. It wasn't in bags. It wasn't in cans. It was all over the ground. So we'd have to get bags and clean up this garbage. And I just remember doing that and feeling dirty. Just feeling like, oh, I got to go take a bath now because you hear little rodents and things running around back there, right? And so you just say, okay, I got to go. So I would take a shower before I went to bed and feel clean. But one thing I started to realize is that while I could clean the dirt off of my body and my hands, I couldn't clean it off of my heart. I couldn't clean the inside and how I felt about myself because of the looking at the magazines and doing those things that I knew were wrong. And I remember saying, what shall I do? What shall I do? And I know some of you are asking the question. You might be a student. You might be in college. You're saying, well, what am I going to do with my life? What am I doing? Here I'm studying hard. I'm doing everything I can to get good grades. Is my life really just all about getting a career and making money and doing and pursuing the American dream here in America? Is that really what I should be doing with my life? And what about you who are singles? You're singles and you're saying you've been through college, you've been now, or you're moving on with your life and you're saying, but I'm still single, I want to be married. And you're saying, Lord, what shall I do with my life? This isn't really what I had planned for my life, but what do you want me to do? What about newlyweds? You get married and you say, is this really what marriage is all about? Is this it? I remember when we were first married, Chrissy and I, that... She said, be careful. So, I would just remember that there were times we got married and we were together all the time. And I started thinking, is she going to go home? I was just feeling like we're together 24/7. At that time, I was looking for work and so was she. So she was going to work with me. I was working for my parents at the time, but she'd come and we were together all the time. And so just saying, Lord, what are we going to do? What shall we do, right? And then, now what about parents? You have kids, right? Your kids are there all the time. They don't It's hard to find alone time. My daughter April has 4 children, wonderful grandchildren. She loves them. But she said the other day, she said, just trying to clean up the house around the kids is like brushing your teeth and eating an Oreo cookie at the same time. It just doesn't work. I mean, what shall I do? And then what about those of us who are empty nesters? We're finally empty nesters, and our children have gone to college, and we have 5 of them. Our youngest is now 21. And then, we now look at each other. What shall we do? Our whole life was our kids. And now we have to learn to love and serve one another. And then beyond that, we get older. Lord, I'm in my 60s. I'm older. What shall I do? So this is a question for all ages. It's a question that we need to ask. And today, as we look at our Acts 22, and we remember and we study that, we will see that question, what shall I do, was asked by Paul, and it was answered by the Lord. So if you turn to Acts 22 for me, and I want you to just keep the scripture in mind, though, that as we study Acts 22, this is our theme. And the theme is John chapter 9, verses 4 through 5. And that is, Jesus said, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. So we must do the works that he's called us to do while we have the time to do it. We know yesterday we celebrated Pastor Ray, tremendous 57 years, served the Lord for over 30 years in ministry and worked really hard to bless God. But Ray is now with the Lord. He has no time anymore on earth to do the works that God called him to do while he was here. The same for us. God is saying to us that we have a limited amount of time to do the work that he's called us to do. And so the question is, what are those works? What shall I do, Lord? If we turn to Acts 22, I'm going to tell the story. You can have there in front of you. But we remember, as we've now studied all of Acts up to chapter 22, we know that 21 ended with the Apostle Paul. Remember, he went into the temple. He was in the temple, and he was fulfilling a vow and helping to complete a vow. And while he was in the temple, he was observed by the Jews. The Jews observed him in the temple, and they assumed because he had come from Ephesus and he had Greeks with him, that he had taken a Greek into the inner temple. And by doing that, they knew that the law said that he had defiled the temple. You could not bring a non-Jew into the temple, and Paul, they believed, had. And that was a capital offense. Remember, they had signs. The Romans even put signs that said that if you enter and you are not a Jew and you enter here, that you're taking your life in your own hands because it is a capital offense. So here we had the Jews, the followers of the law. They see Paul and they believe he's taken a Gentile into the temple. And so they know this is terrible. They grab Paul and they try to kill him. The Bible says they tried to kill him. This mob tried to beat him to death. When the Roman soldiers, the tribunes, saw what was happening, they were stationed up above in the temple. They saw down below this commotion. They ran down and they rescued Paul. They grabbed him from the hands of those who were trying to kill him. They lifted him up and they chained him up, as Paul had been told by those who had spoken a prophecy to him that he would go to Jerusalem and be chained and bound. Well, now he was chained and bound by the Romans. They had no idea why, but they did it anyway. They just said, you're guilty until proven innocent, I guess. A little different than how we have it here, innocent until proven guilty, right? But they chained him up and they lifted him up and they had to carry him out of the crowd. And when they got to the barracks, they put him down, and Paul says, please, he begged them, please let me speak to the people. And I want you to think of Paul for just a minute. Think of him, right? How did he look? He'd just been grabbed and beaten and pulled, and his hair was probably a mess if he had any, and his clothing was probably ripped and torn. His face was bruised and bleeding. And yet Paul has one thing in mind. Let me talk to the crowd. Please, I beg you, let me talk to the crowd. And the tribune says, okay. I mean, that's amazing in itself, that they say, sure, we'll release you to speak to them. So he does. He's released, and it says, beginning in chapter 22, he starts off by saying, brothers and fathers, I make my defense to you today. And he's speaking in Hebrew. And for them, that was everything. He's now speaking in the dialect or the language that they understand. And so Paul is speaking to them, and now they're quiet. And that's also a miracle. They had just tried to kill him, and now they're listening. And so Paul says here, brothers and fathers, I make to you my defense. And I'm telling you, as an attorney, that's for those of you who don't know, I'm still a practicing attorney, and I've practiced law since 1987. And I've done prosecution, criminal prosecution, and I've done criminal defense. And here Paul is standing to speak. And he says, let me make my defense to you. And I know as a criminal defense attorney, I would tell him, Paul, you have the right to remain silent. And you should remain silent right now, Paul, because anything you say can and will be used against you, Paul. But Paul could care less. He was going to make his defense. Well, he stood up, and did he say, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't take a Gentile in the temple. You're wrong, because he hadn't. No. Paul doesn't do that at all. In fact, what Paul begins to do is he begins to give his testimony. He begins to tell the mob about who he is. He says, I was a Jew among Jews. I was trained under Gamaliel. In Jerusalem, I was raised here. And he said, you can even ask the priests who are here. They know that they, back in the day, they gave me warrants to actually go arrest these Christians. And that's what I was doing. I was so dedicated to preserving the law and protecting the image of God that I went and arrested the people of the way. He said I had these letters, and these were arrest warrants, and I would arrest them and bring them back. He says I was even a murderer, because we know that he assisted in the murder of Stephen. And here he is saying these things, but why? It doesn't seem to make sense to what had just happened. It's not a defense. But he is clearly, as he goes on, he's telling about all the things that he did. And then he gets to verse 6. And this is where we need to really pay close attention, because remember, the things that have happened to those in the Bible, those experiences that they've had are for our instruction. So let's look at what happened. Paul says, as I was on my way and drew near to Damascus about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, what shall I do, Lord? This is Paul. He's persecuting these believers in Jesus. He thought Jesus was nothing more than a blasphemer. And here he is being confronted by Jesus himself. And Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? Who are you? You just knocked me to the ground. I can't see. Who are you? Can you imagine when Paul heard, I am Jesus of Nazareth, that you are persecuting? The very Son of God. And then Paul, his question, what shall I do, Lord? And what is important to understand, just like you, before you were a Christian, you may have been calling out to God and saying, what shall I do? But you didn't say Lord. Because we know the definition of the word Lord is master, king. it's the ruler of you. And when you call somebody Lord, you're saying, you are my master. And so we could say, what shall I do to God? But oftentimes, right, we treat Jesus as though he is our servant. Do this for me, Lord. I need you to help me here. Do this, please. Instead of treating him as the master that he is. And here Paul says, what shall I do, Lord? So now he's acknowledging who Jesus is. And he says, you're my Lord and master now. What shall I do? And as we continue to read, we see that the Lord doesn't answer him right away. And when we ask that question ourselves of the Lord, and there are times when we're asking that question, Lord, what shall I do? And I remember when I was full-time working as an attorney just a year ago, and running my law firm, and seeing this church, this home church of ours that I love so much, been here since 1982. I came here as a student at Santa Clara University, and I accepted the Lord I don't know how many times every Sunday for the next 5 weeks. I mean, I was just raising my hand every time Pastor Mike would say, you know, who wants to give their heart to the Lord? I do today, I do today. He had to tell me, you don't have to do it every day if you're, you know. So, but this church, it has such great history to us. And Pastor Ray is part of that, but so much of it. And just seeing that this church was dying and crying out to the Lord, what shall we do? What are we going to do, Lord? What do you want us to do? But I had to ask the question that Paul asked, what shall I do? What is my role? What shall I do? And I didn't expect the answer. I didn't expect the answer. And you'll see the answer came to me as it came to Paul. Because Jesus says to him, and the Lord said to me, rise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came into Damascus. So God doesn't always tell us right away. He doesn't tell you right away. You have to keep persevering and pushing through, and we know that Paul did. Because in Acts chapter 9, it tells us, and that's the story of this conversion. In Acts chapter 9, it tells us that Paul was praying. He didn't eat for 3 days, and during that time he had been praying and seeking the Lord. What shall I do? What shall I do? And then the story gets even better. Because what's exciting about this is how God uses the church. He uses you. He uses me. He uses others to answer that question that somebody else is praying. What shall I do, Lord? And we know the story of Ananias. And if we go on to read, it tells us that Ananias, a believer in Damascus at that time, was also in a vision. He had a vision, and during that vision he hears God calling him. And Ananias, what does he say? He says, here I am, Lord. So Ananias is also recognizing that God is his master, and he has to do what he says, not knowing yet what God's going to ask Ananias to do. But he says, here I am, Lord. What would you have me to do? Same question I asked, and I know you've asked. And you've said to the Lord, here I am. What shall I do? But that's a dangerous question. And sure enough, that's what happened to Ananias. Because Jesus tells him, there's this man, you may have heard of him. His name is Saul of Tarsus. Yes, I've heard of that man. He's here to arrest us. He's here to take us back and to kill us. Yeah, that guy. I want you to go visit him. Lord, wait a minute. No, I want you to go visit him because he's had a vision, and he has a vision of a man named Ananias coming to him. So you go to him and you tell him these things that I'm telling you. So Ananias, we're told, he went to him. And remember, this is the question, what shall I do, Lord? And I want us to remember that this week, this week, let's go into prayer with the Lord. Let's get on our face before the Lord. Let's ask Him as Christians, what shall I do, Lord? And be prepared. Have a journal. Get ready to write down what He tells you to do. And write it down, even if it doesn't make sense. You're in the Word. You're praying. What shall I do, Lord? What shall I do? Well, this is Paul praying for 3 days, fasting. He's blind. He can't see. He hasn't had that prayer answered yet. And then Ananias comes and says, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour, I received my sight and saw him. And remember, Paul's telling this testimony to the mob, and they're listening. And he said, the God of our fathers, this is Ananias speaking, the God of our fathers appointed you to know His will, to see the righteous one, to hear a voice from His mouth. For you will be a witness for Him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. So what did Ananias tell him? He answered the very question for him. And when I was praying, what shall I do, Lord? What can I do to help this church? What can I do? I had brothers come to me. And they came separately. They were elders in the church, and they came to me. And they said, we believe this is what God is telling you should do. And Bernie was one of them. Had they not been faithful, like Ananias was, to say, this is a word from the Lord I have for you. I don't know if you can confirm that or not, but this is from Him, as I believe, and I know, I love you, and I know that you won't hold it against me if I'm wrong, but this is what I have for you. In the same way, Ananias spoke that word to Paul. And do you think Paul believed that word was from the Lord? He demonstrated that in power, didn't he? He prayed for him, the scales and fell off his eyes, of course. This is a word from the Lord, no doubt about it. And so what did the Lord tell Paul through Ananias? He told Paul, you are appointed to know His will. That's what He's telling to each one of us. As a believer, when you accept Christ as your Lord and Savior, His Spirit lives within you. And now you are appointed to know the will of God. Can you imagine that? You're appointed to know the will of God. What shall you do? You shall know the will of God. What else did He say? You are appointed to see the righteous one. He told Paul, you're going to see the righteous one. Who's the righteous one? Jesus. You're going to see Him. And how do we see Jesus? We see Jesus working in our lives. When we allow Him to work, we see Him work in our lives and the lives of other people. You are appointed to hear the voice of Jesus. To hear the voice of Jesus. That's what we're appointed to do. But I can tell you, if you're talking all the time in your prayer time, you're not going to hear anybody. Right? There are times you have to be silent before the Lord. You have to say, Lord, you said that I'm appointed as a believer to hear you. I want to hear you. What do you have to say to me today? And listen. We have to listen. But then finally He said to Paul, you will be a witness for Jesus to every one of you of what you have seen and heard. Of what He had seen and heard. Again, that's the same will that He has for all of us as believers, is to be a witness to this world of what we have seen and of what we have heard. And I'm going to tell you, it's tough. I've had witnesses as an attorney and put them on the stand. And I ask them, what have you seen and what have you heard? And they oftentimes want to tell me, well, this is what my wife told me happened. And they start telling me what somebody else saw and heard. And I tell them, no. If I want to hear from your wife, I'll call her as a witness. I want to hear from you. What have you seen and heard? Well, and then they go off to tell me what somebody else told them. And again, have to bring them back. No, if you can't tell me what you have personally seen and heard, then I can't use you. You're not a percipient witness. I can't use you. It's all hearsay, so sorry, I can't use you. Well, that's the same way with Jesus. How can I be a witness if we have not experienced the very power and working of God in our own lives? And that requires us to take steps of faith. Can you imagine how many of you believe that Peter, after he walked on water, told everybody? I mean, my goodness, what I did, I walked on water. Look at what happened to me. I mean, of course, right? I'm telling you, yesterday's celebration for Pastor Ray, we're going to be talking about what we've seen and heard for years. That was an amazing day because we saw the power of God move. And what my job is to do is to be like your coach and to encourage you to actually do something, to have an ambition to follow Jesus, to do what he's calling you to do for the short time we have. It soon will be night, and we won't have the chance to do these great things. So do what God is calling you to do so that you can be the witness of what you have seen and heard. And we have Paul doing that very thing. He's standing before this mob, cared less about his own freedom, could care less that he might be executed. He was standing and telling them, beaten to death practically, saying, this is what I've seen, and this is what I've heard. And he gives his testimony. And then we know that as he's finishing his account, that the Lord keeps him quiet, and then all of a sudden, verse 21, Paul says, and he said to me, he's telling about what God said to him, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And up to this word they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. So we have to remember, the way our words are received has nothing to do with our obligation to speak those words. We have an obligation to speak of what we've seen and heard. And we may be speaking to a very hostile crowd. They're not happy with what you're saying, but you're speaking the truth. And you're saying, this is my personal experience. You can't deny it. I can tell you what God has done for me, and you can't deny that. And I will do that because that's what I've been appointed to do, is to be a witness to everyone of what I have seen and heard. I want you to know that I'm far past my notes. I don't even know where I am. But the point that God is making to us as believers is that we are to be his witnesses. And we are to ask that question, what shall I do, Lord? What shall I do? We're all aware of the story of Esther, remember? Remember Esther? Esther, who was a Jew and became a queen. And now the Jews themselves were about to be annihilated. And she had been asked by her uncle to go and talk to the king and to plead for the lives of the Jews. And she said, if I go in and speak to the king and he doesn't extend the golden scepter, that means I'm dead. And he hasn't invited me in. And what did her uncle say to her? Why do you think that you're going to escape this? You too will also die, and God will use somebody else. That it for such a day as this, that you were appointed for this work. How do you know that you're not? So what does she say? Okay. So fast and pray for 3 days for me. And then I'll go in. And you can imagine she's praying and calling out to God during those 3 days. What shall I do? Should I go? Should I not go? What should I do? But at the end of it, she went. She risked her whole life. And we know the story. The people were saved because she was willing to do. And that's what God's saying to us, each one of us. Let's not be afraid. So I'm going to ask a brother, a young man who was raised in this church, Kevin Catano. Can we put up his slides for us, please? This is Kevin. Kevin, come on up. Kevin was raised in this church. Kevin is 29 years old. And Kevin has been on 2 missions with Adventures in Mission, one 11 months and one 7 months. And these are pictures of him going around the world, doing all sorts of great things for the Lord. And Kevin was born in North San Jose and came to the home church with his parents and sister when he was in 1st grade. He grew up going to local private school, Milpitas Christian, and went to Piedmont Hills for high school. It was between these years that he first began the journey of making Christianity his faith and not just his parents. After high school, he had no clue what he wanted to do with his life and spent several years exploring things at a couple of colleges in the area. Eventually, he got an AA in business administration from Evergreen Valley College and then went to San Jose State to get his BA in accounting information systems in May of 2011. The summer after graduation, he began work at the accounting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers. So, Kevin, are you still working for PricewaterhouseCoopers?
Nope, not anymore.
Okay. So, can you just tell the body here, if you don't mind answering this question, what does the question, "What shall I do, Lord," mean to you?
That's a question that I ask all the time. Being out in the mission field, it's obviously a question that you have to ask when you go out and do ministry. You know, a lot of the ministry I did was just walking the streets and talking to people. And so it's like, Lord, what shall we do? Shall we go here? Shall we go there? Shall we talk to that person? And I think what it means to me is it's humbling myself before the Lord and saying, what do you want me to do? Like I'm putting aside my will and my desires. I want to go back and put on a movie or something. I don't really want to walk these streets on this hot day. It's so humid out here. But Lord, what do you want me to do? Not what do I want to do? And so it's humbling myself and allowing the Lord to guide me. I was telling you earlier this morning that it's, the Bible talks about the Lord is our guide. He's not this overarching tyrant who tells us exactly what we always have to be, or who makes us do all these things. He tells us what to do, but he gives us the choice. People have told me he's a gentleman. He just comes and guides you.
Kevin, let me ask you, when you left PricewaterhouseCoopers, did you know what you were going to be doing?
No, I had no idea. I had an idea. The Lord gave me the word ministry, but he didn't give me any clear direction as to what it was going to be. And so I fumbled around for about 3 months exploring that before I felt the Lord calling me to be a missionary.
And so we understand it. And when you left PricewaterhouseCoopers, that was after you had gotten your degree and were earning a living and working in a profession. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so God called you into ministry, so we know he left Pricewaterhouse without knowing what he was going to do. And so how did God answer that question for you? What did you end up doing?
Oh, obviously I ended up finding the world race and going on the mission trip. But it took a lot of failing, honestly, trying different things and seeing where the Lord was taking me. It took 3 months before I found it, but I thought I was going to go to seminary and pursue ministry through that way, getting schooling. But the Lord's like, no, I don't want you to go to school. I want you to have these experiences and go out in the field and serve me in that way. And I said yes.
And so can you tell everybody, while you were on the mission field, he went on this world race, 11 months, through how many different countries?
11 countries.
11 countries. And then he went back again as a leader for 7 months. And so can you just tell the body, when you were working as a missionary, how did that question get answered for you? What shall I do, Lord, while you were working? Can you give them an example about how God answered that prayer for you?
Yeah, I'll go share 2 real quick ones. First is just the simple, asking Lord, what do you want me to share with people? How do you want me to encourage people? We were having a time of worship when we were in Bolivia a few months ago, and one of my co-leaders came up and said, I feel like we need to just encourage one another. So I asked the Lord if he's bringing anyone to mind and a word for them. I felt the Lord bringing to mind this one girl. I'll just call her Mary for now. And I was like, Lord, what do you want me to tell Mary? And I saw a picture of her in a white dress saying, you are worthy. And that was a picture I actually got for her several months ago, but I didn't feel I was to share it with her. But this time I felt that it was coming up again. So I'm like, Lord, what do you want me to do with this? Is this something I should share with her? And he said yes. And so I went straight to her and I told her that, and she started crying immediately. I talked to her afterwards, and she said the moment before I showed up to tell her that, she was thinking, Lord, am I ever going to be married? Is this ever going to be a thing that I have? And so that spoke directly to her heart, and it was because I was obedient to the Lord and shared it in that moment that it spoke to her.
Good. And there was another time you told me about when you were out with the group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was when we were in South Africa. There's one picture up there of a few of my friends baptizing a boy, and one of our ministries there was to do sports ministry with a group of kids. And so we'd go out and play sports with these kids all the time and use it to teach Bible stories and stuff. And the other thing that we did was a lot of the street ministry, street evangelism. And we normally did this in the morning, but one time we decided to do it at night, and we meet in this field and we pray to the Lord, where do you want us to go? What do you want us to do? Who do you want us to talk to? And he led us to this group of Rastafarian drug dealers who hang out at a park right near the field where we'd play. And we know these are the kind of guys that you don't cross. You don't walk through their territory. They're going to beat you up, mug you, whatever. But that's what the Lord was telling us to do, and so that's what we did. I was honestly one of the more scared ones. I was like, I kind of hung back a little bit at first, but slowly as I saw my teammates getting more involved and engaging with these guys, and that it wasn't so bad, I started to feel more comfortable and had a really great conversation with the gentleman at that time. But this whole time, while we were there, they were pushing aside people that were coming to get drugs. So drug dealing was stopped for that hour and a half we were there hanging out. And it ended up being that we played a soccer game with these guys. They were really good at soccer, and they loved playing sports, and that's what we were doing. So let's organize a game. So that Saturday, we played a game with them, and the head drug dealer showed up too, and he was actually sending people out to bring in the other guys who were on their corners dealing drugs to come play soccer and stop dealing. So once again, for about 2 hours, drug dealing stopped in this community. And the coolest thing, in my thinking, was at the very end, our host, the guy that was working with us and helping us along that month, the head drug dealer came up to him and said, if these Americans can come to our town and minister to these kids and love on them and spend time with them, we can do better for our community as well.
Wow. So Kevin, thank you very much. Can we give him a hand? I'll take the mic from you. Thank you, Kevin. I was talking to Kevin outside of church last Sunday, and I knew I was going to be preaching on what shall I do, Lord, and I was asking about what he had just done. So I said, okay, well, you're going to go and tell all the body. Okay, really? So that is a real-life example, and I want to encourage you. Don't just have a pre-planned idea for your life. Ask God, and he'll take you on a great adventure.